Says it'll take a few seconds, but looks like we are live, at least to me.
Exciting.
It is exciting. Hey
Yeah.
everyone, welcome to the first show of Leadership Geeks Unplugged. The plan for this show is to have some great conversations, more in-depth conversations with people like Mikaila, who will take us on a journey through some of the nuances of remote work and how to think about that. We'll try to distill some insights, both for people who work perhaps in a remote context, but also for people who are just balancing how to think about working from home, maybe, or hybrid models or on-site models. Soyas, that I'm a co-founder of, is a on-site, like fully on-premise company. So I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation. Welcome to the show, Mikaila.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So we have the format is sort of loose in the sense that we'll have up to a certain amount of time. I mean, it's set for 90 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time. If we feel we're done after an hour and 15 minutes, we'll cut it there. If we feel we need an hour 45, there's probably some gold hidden there that we want to dive into anyway. So then we'll let it run. So if you are listening in and you have somewhere you need to be at a certain point, then you'll have to catch the last bit on as your favorite podcast streaming device or app or on YouTube afterwards. Mikaila, won't you get us started just by maybe introducing yourself real brief?
Yeah, so hi everybody who's here. My name is Mikaila Reed. My pronouns are she, hers, and today I am the Director of People and Culture at a company called MUI. We are the world's most comprehensive React component library, a small but mighty team of about 46 engineers and others working remotely across 11 different time zones and supporting thousands and thousands of developers and designers to create amazing UI experiences, basically.
And your role there, can you say briefly something about that? Like, what is Director of People and Culture in your setting?
It would probably be easier to say what it's not because it's so broad and nebulous, but I do a lot of the usual suspects. I'm responsible for things like manager enablement, onboarding, all things across the employee life cycle. I also spend a significant portion of my portfolio planning our retreats, which are known as MUI's Together Weeks. I do a little bit of employer branding and social engagement, and I've got my own managerial responsibilities as well for our team. So, yeah, there's a ton involved.
That's awesome. So to get us started, I wrote down, and of course you and I have touched base before the meeting up today to discuss what we should go through. And one thing I'd love for us to sort of at least keep an eye on is not give any promises, but at least things we would strive to hit on or takeaways that viewers or listeners could expect. So I think that if we can manage to give people context around remote protocols, and the reason I don't call it policies is just because I'm a little allergic to that word, um, enable people to have a more like reflected and nuanced thinking on this topic. Then of course we'll dive into ways that you have sort of near your heart in terms of recognition and collaboration in any setting. And then it would be awesome to try to see what could non-remote workplaces potentially learn from remote workplaces. Do you
Yeah,
have anything to add there?
it sounds great. I mean, it's a big promise, but I hope that everyone will leave this call and walk away with some actionable ideas of ways they could implement things differently at their org for the better. In particular, I would probably bring to the table some different approaches when it comes to thinking about how you codify culture, how you encourage social connection, how you reduce loneliness in all of these environments. And yeah, I hope that it will be interesting and useful to some of the people listening.
Having spoken to you for roughly an hour before this, I'm positive it will be. Um, could you start us off by maybe when you are an organization that is fully remote, uh, bring us into the terminology or the language that you use so that some of the words we'll use are not foreign to people.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. So, I mean, just defining the difference between remote, hybrid, and on-site as I understand them. Like remote means fully remote. You might not even have a centralized headquarters. You might not have a physical office of any kind. And there's no mandated requirement to be centralized in any given place any number of days a year. Hybrid, if even one day a year is mandated for your team to be at a centralized location, you are hybrid. Most hybrid organizations, though, have different requirements as far as presenteeism or getting into the same place. It might be 2 days a quarter, it might be 2 days a week in our London hub or here or there, right? And then on-site means that you have a dedicated physical headquarters. Maybe you have multiple if you have different entities and so on, but the expectation is for your employees to work from that centralized location, whatever it is, 100% of the time, basically.
Yeah, so we would use the terminology on-site, like centralized
Yes.
workplace or whatever for any company that where they have a working from home policy or like protocol, but where they do have an office that most people come to most of the time. But then where do we draw the line? Like if you are, let's say, you are in New York, but 10% of your workforce is in India,
Mm.
customer success, or you have a Mexican, or even a, let's say, a Californian development hub. Would you call that hybrid, or should we, like, where do we draw the line?
I think this is even the problem with relying on the terminology to reduce down and express how it is you work and how you expect your team to work together. Like, this is why the phrase remote washing has arisen as job seekers are getting frustrated when they go search for a remote job and discover that it is, in fact, hybrid, requiring them to commute to a central office some number of days per week, per quarter, per year, what have you. I wish companies would instead focus on communicating tangibly how we work and what happens on site if you are expected to come on site. Like, what is the purpose of convening? What are we getting done there? How does it work? Yeah. So rather than draw the line, I'd almost start challenging people. Don't figure out and self-brand yourself as one of these. Just figure out how to concisely communicate the way that you work.
Yeah, because I guess if you are, let's say, your consultancy, but you have 3 offices across even one market, it would, to a larger degree, probably resemble like a hybrid workplace, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe
Yeah,
you should even adopt some of the remote protocols because people are not in the same location. But it's just I think a lot of companies have to an increasing degree and like over time have outsourced certain functions or
mm-hmm.
responsibilities to markets where and then there are all the companies that also are like, let's say 25%, 20% are on a headquarter, but then they feel generally they are a remote company because
Mm-hmm.
the majority of their employees are remote. And we might not get to a specific terminology for each of them, but at least there are some gray zones in the middle. You have your on-site, that's probably pretty easy. There's working from home, but most people come to an office. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's fully remote, that's also pretty easy. No one has an office. But maybe, is that fair to say, maybe 2, 3 people located in the same city meet up, work in the same co-working space or something like that, right?
Yeah, I
That
mean,
could
some
happen.
remote companies also might have a physical office, but there's just no mandate for
Okay.
usage. There's no required presence for employees to attend there. I would say remote companies with offices treat them in a very different way, and it's more seen as a tool like anything else to help advance certain types of work in certain types of ways. But yeah, the expectation isn't that you present there. And I think also you touched on something interesting with how there are a lot of gray zones with different ways that companies might be structured and set up and outsourcing and all of this. This is another reason I dislike needing to rely upon and reduce down to a single term, because I also think a lot of hybrid organizations are remote, or if you are hybrid, rather, you should be adopting remote principles, processes, policies, to use the word you're allergic to.
That's just because policy sounds like government. It sounds bureaucratic, and I think sometimes I don't think policies needs to be that, and that's why
Mm.
it's just the connotations you get from that word. Just yeah. But moving on from that, you are working at MUI, and I think it's interesting to hear, like, even starting with you guys, why is that a remote company?
I mean, it was remote from inception, so this wasn't something reactive in response to COVID. I think that one of the main reasons that we adopted this was simply because it's something our founders deeply believe in. You know, they have a massive value for autonomy and freedom and flexibility. And that was very, very present in our original company values, and it's still very present today. So I think they chose this for the flexibility that it would offer to everyone, the power of remote work in order to drive greater performance and ways of life. And also there's, you know, other tangible business benefits like cost savings of not having an office and getting to reinvest all of that resource into something more exciting like one of our Together weeks. And lastly, the people that we are looking for to join our team tend to have a very specialized skill set. It is very difficult to find. So having access to a wider global talent pool is obviously a massive advantage to us and one that we wanted to, get to take advantage of.
Yeah, and that sort of get us started because I did want to at least take the listeners on a little D route where we might not try to discuss or agree on what model is the best, because I don't think, and I also believe you don't think it makes sense to discuss it in that way. Different models, different ways of organizing make sense for different companies at different stages at different times, and
Yes.
it's all about who does what when and so forth. But what are some of the, you mentioned some of the reasons why MUI is remote. What are some of the, you would say, general advantages and maybe also challenges of being remote?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I'll just reiterate and underscore some of the ones mentioned already for remote organizations. You've got much greater degree of flexibility and work-life balance is accessible to people. You've got cost savings on offices, of course, access to a broader talent pool, and even productivity. You know, there's a lot of studies now coming out to reveal the impact of remote work and flexibility on employee productivity, and it's significant. It's not small. Some of the felt disadvantages, I would say, for our team, and just from my history of working remotely in the last 6 years, would be things like communication, and specifically communication not being more difficult, but just requiring a different degree of effort, a different degree of intentionality to make sure that it is really effective. Another disadvantage, which I personally don't feel, but I understand a lot of people do, is isolation, social loneliness, or disconnection. This is a major challenge for companies adopting this model, and especially those that did it in a reactive way, and who maybe tried to fix it by replicating office experiences over Zoom and this sort of thing, a little like copy paste. There's also some technical challenges at time, and management and oversight can have, it can be difficult. With a hybrid setup, you almost have more flexibility because you have access to a tangible, centralized space where you can convene people easily. Like, if our team wanted to quickly, easily get together for some business opportunity or problem and solve it in person, that would take a lot of planning. That would take a lot
Yeah.
of resource. But for some hybrid organizations or on site, you can easily convene. It's there, it's ready for you to do. It maybe doesn't cost as much. There's also
Yeah.
Go
Sorry to
ahead.
interrupt. I was about to say, because like I would agree that in general you get a larger degree of flexibility and autonomy over your time and your work in a remote context. And again, remote, I can clearly hear by use meaning no mandate to be in the office or be at some centralized location. So to some degree, only to some degree, not to a complete degree, the way we organize is remote. And the fact that there is no days you are needed or required at the office unless we have planned that
Mhm.
type of meeting or get together where we wanted to do something. And it's the same way that you don't necessarily think, or let me put it in my words at least, and then you can respond to it. Isolation and social disconnect also exists in a centralized or on-site organization,
Absolutely.
but it's probably at least by default less of a challenge. Just like I think that flexibility and autonomy as a default is stronger in a remote context. But maybe what's interesting is, does it have to be either of them?
Yeah. And I don't necessarily think it's the case that things are inherently more difficult or more easy, but maybe you have more tools easily and readily available to you given any one of these environments. To just repeat, like the similar example to what I said before, if we have an office space and it's readily accessible and everyone lives in a very close proximity to that, I can quickly and easily organize a physical meetup for whatever purpose I want. With our company's model, that is not as easy. That is not as readily available to me. And it doesn't mean that social connection or loneliness or team bonds are inherently more difficult to manage. They just require different things. They require a different mindset. They require a different degree of intentionality. And hearing you describe that, oh, well, the way we operate is remote actually by these predefined criteria that we talked about, I would start to shift into our broader conversation on the protocols then, because actually how you work is also going to determine if you are more leaning in the remote or the hybrid direction, right?
Yeah, and just maybe to clarify for the listeners again, like in Sawyers, we have, again, also like basically you described, Mikkel, my co-founder, and I, we wanted to build a workplace where we had not just social connections, but that being tied to physical meeting people in quote unquote real life.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, we were intentional about building that culture from the get-go. And we do expect people, because we communicate that, and we're not that large of an organization either. So to have that sort of work, we do have at least expectations that people are here what we call the majority of the time. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not defined where or when, and one person might go for a month to someplace else, but it's not mandated, but it is expected. So it's sort of in a gray zone where I don't think you or I would call it a remote culture, but we might have some of the flexibility of a remote culture, and as you say, with some at least advantages, and then obviously some other disadvantages connected to that. But yeah, it probably makes sense to jump into some of the modes or the models of thinking about these things.
Yeah. One thing that occurred to me listening to you describe the difference between being mandated versus expected, and if there is a real difference there, was the question of, is this in your performance criteria somewhere? Because that
No.
is the true expression of whether or not it's mandated. Some people might hear you say, we expect you to be here a majority of the time, or we encourage you even to be here majority of the time.
Yeah.
And they will hear that and think, there's no way for me to get promoted then if I'm not present. I'm going to be on the back burner for these types of opportunities potentially, you know?
Yeah.
And we've been seeing these headlines, right, more recently from Dell and other usual suspects of come back to the office or we're not going to promote you. So that's why it just raised that question in my mind of, is it somewhere in your performance criteria to be present or not?
No, it's in our cultural codex
Mhm.
that we enjoy being together
Mhm.
and enjoy that, but no, it would never. It's individual, first of all. How much makes sense or doesn't make sense, and then I'm sure we'll face some challenges in the future where someone is moving somewhere, and we have to decide whether that can coexist with the way we operate, because we've been intentional about, like, we don't know how to manage remote work, and
Mhm.
that would take practice, training, and a change in operating model for us to be able to manage that, and that would distract from our current culture and operating model of everyone being in the same place the majority of the time, and probably most people are just working from home because they need the flexibility that day, or because
Mhm.
they want focus time to dedicate themselves to a specific task more so than. Yeah, so we're very transparent with candidates and in our job posts that is what they should join us if that's something that they see bringing the most happiness to their work life.
Mhm.
So I still, I'm not sure I answered your question even, but
I think you
um,
did. And you also went back to a point we were touching on earlier of this need to really define what flexibility actually looks like in tangible terms for your business, and not relying on remote, hybrid, on-site to communicate at all. There's so
Yeah,
much gradients under each of those types of work models.
and it also comes back to same with I speak to many companies having to talk to them about our platform Soyas and speak to probably a few hundred directors or head or VP of people and culture every year, and some of them had this phrase free from time and space or something along those lines. It was in Danish, so but where it's also clear that some of our employees can reap the benefits of working whenever they prefer,
Mm,
whereas let's say people in sales, they can't really we can't really give them the same flexibility
mhm,
because being in a different time zone, let's say you were in Latin America, if you had to do sales in Europe, that would put some requirements and some on when you would do your work to be
mhm,
able to even reach people that in within business hours where they would expect you or even want to talk to you. So it's like, uh, yeah, I don't know where that leaves us. It's just it felt meaningful to mention as well that the
mhm.
flexibility in time also becomes so it's to some degree derived of your function or your responsibilities as well.
Yeah. And I think another word sometimes used in place of the Danish phrase was like location independence or time zone agnostic, or there's other kind of language and vocabulary floating around out there. But yeah, as you've pointed out rightly, like there are constraints, just as machinists and factory workers unfortunately cannot work remotely. Like, if you're in a support role or a role where you need to have access to a very specific time set with a group you're serving, then yeah, you might not have as much flexibility available to you in terms of the hours you work.
And we actually got a few questions that I'll just read aloud in a second. But before we do that, like now that you mentioned factory workers, I know that Elon Musk is a good example of a controversial man who has opinions on most things in life. One of them that because their factory workers wouldn't have the benefit of working from home or working whenever they preferred or found it worked best for them, the rest of their workforce shouldn't have those benefits either to some degree.
Mm.
Like how should one, in your opinion, think about this as an individual thing versus a workplace thing?
I find this argument to be really interesting and also like to rely upon a pretty shallow notion of what equality means, what accessibility means, what fairness is. It's not the same thing for everyone. Fairness and equality is not the same thing for everyone. And there's a brilliant illustration. I've forgotten now where it's from, but I'll share it after the call so that we can give it out to listeners. And I'm sure people will recognize it from the way I'm going to describe it. You have three individuals standing behind a fence, trying to peer over it. And in the first image, in fact, I'm just going to grab it because I know I have this on my computer. You have three individuals standing on a fence, in front of a fence, trying to peer over it, and some of them are all different heights, of course. These individuals by nature are different heights. And, some can't see, some can. And then in the second image, which is supposed to be a demonstration of equality, they don't have all the same size boxes to stand upon. They have different aids and different supports to enable them to be at the same height peering over the fence. Yeah, I find that argument from Elon Musk to just be a bit lazy, I think. I think it's lazy and misleading, to be charitable.
Niels, one of our head of consulting, he had did a show with a Danish, let's say, entrepreneurial expert called Martin Torborg, who said
Mm,
just because most people use a 44 size 44 in shoes doesn't mean we should make everyone wear the same size of shoes, and it's a very it doesn't say there's not much logic in that anecdote, but
mhm,
it does hit to some degree. But it's also to be again bring back the nuances. It does seem like in Denmark, for example, equality of opportunity is one of the greatest in the world, and at least measured by how many move from the bottom quartile of economic success to the
mm,
top quartile in a generation. So if it was perfectly random, then it would be perfect, at least equality of opportunity, right? At least by that measure. And even so, some people would end up with a large fortune, just like some of the richest in the world. And even if the opportunities were equal, it still wouldn't seem fair that someone got so much. So, and sort of making that perspective into a workplace setting, let's say engineers, for example, could benefit from, you can work wherever you want, whenever you want, because it doesn't really matter as long as you have your output. At what point do you think it becomes unfair to some degree that some people in an organization have such a skewed level of constraints versus others?
That's a great question, and one that I think probably is very context dependent, right,
Of
to
course.
answer. I feel like I could spend hours delving into a specific singular case of that, right? But giving a broad stroke response is a bit difficult. But I would just repeat back that, you know, working with a really narrow conception of what fairness or equality is the problem there, because it's not reducible to numbers, right? It's not about having the same things at your disposal, having the same setup necessarily even. And yeah, even just as productivity is not reducible to tasks completed, right?
Yeah.
Productivity is not tasks completed. It's so much bigger than that. Yeah, that's a great question.
And it's also where it's hard because it becomes tangible and practical, and it has to find where the line should be drawn to some degree, right? Uh, and in most cases, are
Yeah.
probably easier to apply some sort of, let's say, common sense to, and by that find the normal truth, or the truth you need to navigate in a
Yeah.
specific scenario.
And I think like the unfortunate reality is also sometimes and I'm saying this as someone who really aims for fairness and equality, it's obviously a major part and responsibility within my role as much as it is a personal passion and like conviction of mine. But the world is imperfect, and like it's we're going to have imperfections. And I think most people don't need a perfect answer to these things or a perfect setup. They need something reasonable. They need something that is clearly justifiable, that treats people and businesses alike with respect and care. And it doesn't have to be the case that because factory workers can't work remote, now all our engineers can't either.
No, but it does seem like, to me, I was just thinking this, that when we talk about sort of some level of transparent pay, for example, we, at least the sort of notion that I subscribe to, is that we can make sure that the same rules apply for everyone, and that would ensure some sort of equality in terms of pay, so that it's equal for men and women if they do have the same position, or whatever it might be, level based on your expertise, your level, whatever it might be. No one says it's fair. The only thing we can promise is people are treated equally. So and that would be in stark contrast to how we think about flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it would be, and I just think that this intersects so nicely with things like neurodiversity and the accessibility and reasonable accommodations that we offer to people in order to give them a more level playing field. And yeah, just like compensation, you want to have the same structures applying to people in terms of both how their base pay is set and how maybe performance increases are offered, or other types of increases, if any, are offered. Yeah, I've like lost my train of thought as to where I was going with this.
No, and I also just pose different difficult questions that I don't have the answer to myself. But so before we move on, maybe let me just read aloud the two questions I at least have seen come in. So Deepak Wag says here, I faced many tough things on collaborating for offering remote developers. I'm not 100% sure what he's asking, but he does say any suggestions for that. If you understand the comment better than me, then feel free to elaborate while I read Camilla's here. So Camilla wrote, Camilla Mies, wonder if Mikaila find that managers have to manage or lead in a very different way when remote versus on-site teams, and if yes, what would the skills managers need to build or have? to transition to more remote management be?
Love that question. I think
She's very clever, so it makes sense.
yeah, I think Deepak, if Deepak was asking about just general collaboration challenges with the team members, I would say like trying to ritualize communication in some way. Whether that's you have a digest that's being circulated, you have a asynchronous stand-up, you have a synchronous stand-up, figuring out what the right cadence is for different information to flow between team members can really aid collaboration. Like the only way people can collaborate effectively is if they have a really high degree of context and alignment. And then to this other question of what are the unique skills, if any, that managers need to develop to thrive in a remote setting, it's unsurprisingly going to be things like emotional intelligence, empathy, and organization, maybe I would say, which sounds kind of throwaway and basic, but we talked about there being a greater degree of intentionality required for remote companies to really get the best out of remote. And the reason I'm going to highlight emotional intelligence and empathy is because remote teams tend to be more multicultural, right? Just by virtue of being distributed and outside of some central physical community, you tend to have very different backgrounds from people working there. You need to be able to be flexible and culturally competent and like attuned to unique differences in how people communicate, in ways that they feel respected, in ways that they feel included, in ways that they have their engagement like ignited, right? And you also need to be very sensitive, aware, curious, like interested in getting beyond like the visible surface. So let me like give an illustration as to what I'm trying to say. If I'm a manager in an office, I can visibly see when a team member of mine is presenting with lower energy, when their body language is communicating that they may be tired, maybe sad, maybe struggling and not thriving for whatever reason. In a remote setting, it's so easy to hide that. I could be crying at my desk, and I have, not at MUI, but at other organizations. I have cried at my desk and sent a "Great, thanks, what else can I do for you this week?" message with a smiley appended to it in Slack, right? And nobody questions or bats an eye. But as a manager, you need to be able to like pick up on the very, very subtle cues and signals in a remote environment that your team are giving off. And if you're struggling to do that, you also just need to explicitly ask about it, right? Like, go that extra mile to figure out how people are really doing. I don't think you can manage well if you're not someone willing to do that, to be honest.
Do you think it's a fair assumption? And I haven't thought deeply about this, don't take it ill if it's a stupid concept, but that the average person who chooses to work in a remote organization has less attraction to social connections than the people who choose to be at in a I mean, obviously some do it because of the flexibility it provides. They might have a family, they might want to have a job somewhere else, especially if it might open up opportunities to work in more advanced organizations or some of the specific problems that you need. So those would probably just be the same as everyone else. But do you think there is a tendency that the people who choose to work in remote have a slightly different, like some traits in different degrees versus people who are in an on-site organization?
I do think that there's a difference. There might be some subtraits or commonalities between people who are attracted to remote work and like why and how they tend to thrive in that environment. But I don't think social connection or gregariousness or like extroversion is one of these. I think what one of these is probably self motivation or drive. Like people who really enjoy working independently and diving deep into what it is that they're on, like undistracted, uninterrupted, right? The remote model really supports that type of work. And I have been noticing anecdotally people who have been working remotely for the last 5 years to multiple decades, telling me that they miss an office environment. But they do cite different things. They don't all say, I miss people. I miss being around people. I miss Friday after work beers. Like, it's not that. It's something different going on. And yeah, so short answer is no, I don't think that social, like, I don't think people are attracted to remote work because they are antisocial necessarily. That's not a trend I would feel confident stating.
No, that was also maybe a way to spice it up a bit, but maybe that people who tend to be very targeted and individualistic in their work, on
Mm.
average, value collaboration less.
Now, see, that is something I would probably nod to. And I don't have a psychological or researched basis for that right now. It's getting me curious, though, and wanting to go read about it after this call. But I can speak from my own lived experience, which is that I very much am an independent worker. I love getting to own something end to end. I love having autonomy to make decisions about my work, and I just find that the pace that I can operate at is so much faster. And when I can do that, I derive a lot of satisfaction from my work. And it's not that I hate collaborating or working with others. It's just that I place a really high value on effective collaboration. And as we said, sometimes there's a greater degree of upfront intentionality and effort and labor required to do this well in a remote setting. Some people are more willing to engage in that than others. Some are more practiced in how to even do it. So yeah, there's a lot going on with that one.
Yeah, because the funny thing is at SciAS we help companies measure well-being, for example, mental health and so forth, and we have a pretty locked-in framework that we use with companies that want to do that, and we can clearly see patterns that remote companies tend to score lower on social. But
Mm,
our algorithms that detect which drivers or factors are important also quite clearly notice that it's typically not what's most heavily correlated with job satisfaction for in those type of companies.
hmm.
So it's like they are less social. They say they are less satisfied with the degree of social relationships they have.
Yes.
But at the same time, we can see that that is not the main driver in those cultures and
Hmm.
organizations for them being happy and thriving in their jobs.
Hmm.
So that suggests to me that the people who choose, at least on average, to dedicate themselves in a remote organization have a little different set of preferences in terms of togetherness or whatever you would call it.
Yeah,
Doesn't mean that they
absolutely.
don't feel a need to belong or meet people or talk to people, but just that it would be interesting that if what they needed the most to be good managers was more EQ, and on average they had a little less.
Hmm. Yeah, that is really fascinating. And I mean, I think I'm curious now also to know
Yeah, ask
what
away.
are the different facets of well-being that you find they are thriving in, like remote teams are thriving at achieving this particular facet of well-being, because that it's a it's not reducible to social connection, right? Just as it's not physical health or emotional
Yes.
health, spiritual, financial, there's so much going on in that. And yeah, I was curious to just
If
learn
I if I
what
had
you.
to, some of the patterns are harder to see because it's
Yeah.
not as clear cut. But I would say what we see in general is that the biggest challenge is managing the social driver. But then again, it's not as big of a challenge because it's generally not what's the most important. But
Yeah.
it is the one that they tend to score the lowest for compared to on-site
What
organizations.
is the most important driver for remote teams in your research and
Typically,
field?
life harmony and contribution.
Interesting. I would think that it would potentially be something like purpose.
But we don't
And
have purpose as like an explicit factor because some people find purpose in life harmony, some find it in development, some find it in social, some find it in recognition or contribution. So for us,
mm,
purpose is sort of hidden in all of them because it's such an abstract phenomena that what I would actually say is that their purposes are just less the social part, whereas we do see other organizations where social is really what drives people to be happy at work, and then that allows for something else that is necessary to keep that functioning along those lines, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes when we hear that remote teams are struggling with this, or they maybe don't understand the importance of it as well. Like it can as much be a difference in personal preferences when it comes to like wanting to have friends at work, right? I know
Yeah.
people that have a preference to keep a high degree of separation between their professional and personal self, and that's the way they like it. And I'm not here to pass judgment upon that whatsoever. But there is very compelling research to show that when you have a friend at work or somebody that you trust has your best interest at heart, that they care about you, that they care about your development, you have all these other tangible positive benefits like comfortability and willingness to take risks, comfortability and willingness to have conflict, healthy conflict, which is so critical to like good teams. Some
But I
people
do
think
think
good
you could. I
teams.
do think you could have like psychological safety to a large degree while not being like satisfied with the level of social relationships at work. So
Yeah.
maybe what you are mentioning is to a larger degree that there needs to be psychological safety, and having a best friend or a really good friend at work will naturally increase that. But it's through that versus the social relationships being the requirement, maybe.
Mm. Yeah, yep, I would agree with that. And I think some people out there just like don't have this requirement, you know, not an active requirement in their mind to make friends at work. And yet, those very same people who don't identify that in themselves would naturally still experience the same benefits that other people
Mm.
would. That's
Yeah.
just the nature of human psychology. And, you were talking earlier about like fundamental human needs to belong, to feel acceptance, to achieve actualization. Like it depends on all of this stuff. Relationships are huge. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and we just had a comment as well from Danilo Leo, uh, a fellow colleague of yours from MUI. Um, it's not really a question, I think, so I won't, and it's a little bit long, so I won't read it out loud, but he's generally saying, no, maybe it will be interesting. He says, there's been a lot of this discourse about the role of one-on-ones, and maybe because of the performance-focused mindset that remote bring in. Many remote companies are promoting not doing them. However, personal connection seems to be a pivotal component of great work, and one-to-ones felt like a way to promote that, particularly with your
Mm,
manager. Curious what you think about the implications of remote versus in-person in relation, as I understand it, in relation to one-on-ones.
mm. Well, I mean, I'm not giving up my one-to-ones anytime soon, and I would caution anyone who thinks that they ought to or that they should and try to understand why they are wanting to make that move because I just derive so much value from my own, and I can't speak on behalf of my direct report. Maybe Nadia would share some of her own lived experience, and hopefully it would be good. But I just find that to be such a sacred space for being able to build relationships in a way that it would require more time, more intentionality, more effort from both of us to do at the same pace. Um, and I'm
No, and
just
just
going,
to underline that, even in like, it's one of the most tracked implementations of an initiative that we have seen in our platform. So
mm,
there's pre-data, data before they start doing it, and we have post data. So actually, like a causal impact of they started doing regular one-on-ones,
mhm,
focusing on well-being, typically unstructured or a home custom-made agenda for that. And I
mhm,
think my experience is talking with managers as well, most freestyle even. So it's different. It is not a set template that they follow across the organization. Despite that, it's the by far the best performing initiative we've seen companies do across industries,
mhm,
sizes, etc. So I think it's easy to say that we have conversations all the time.
mhm.
It's easy to say that we could have that conversation anytime, just come do it. But whenever the manager takes initiative to agree, as I agree with, have that sacred space for some intentional deeper conversations, diving into some topics that might not be well suited for, do you have 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Uh, um, just seems it's pretty clear from our data that that has huge impact on well-being.
Mhm.
Um, So that is a big recommendation to keep those. I do understand the theoretical, ideological arguments for why it perhaps shouldn't be there, but in practice, what we see is it does a lot of good, especially versus the effort or input it requires.
Yeah, I just, and I'm saying this as a remote advocate, right? And somebody who would probably always prefer to work remotely myself. There just is no substitute for that face-to-face method of building connection. And part of the reason for that is grounded in the psychology of getting access to people's body language and expression and tone of voice. Like the most powerful lever on effective communication is actually your tone. It's not what you say at all, it's how it's said. And there's been some really,
Or the eyes.
and the eyes. There's really interesting research about how in audio only calls also, this is just to demonstrate the power of tone of voice, right? In audio only calls versus video and audio, or purely in writing, right? Well, text chat, IM, whatever. You are far more accurate at determining a person's emotional state. If I pick up the phone and I hear you and I say, "Hey, Christian, how's it going today?" If I can see you on Zoom, I'm going to be less accurate at determining what your emotional state is at the time than if I just heard your voice, which is fascinating.
That is fascinating.
But yeah, this
But
is
how
what I think
I'm
of.
just wondering how that coincides with one of my favorite projects that I like to reference is Google's project Aristotle.
Yes,
They
psychology.
looked into what makes a great team, like a team that performs and are happy. Basically, looking at and Google, they dedicated some of the best researchers, anthropologists, organizational psychologists, and scientists to dive into that. And they spent several years. And essentially, what they found, to boil it down, is that the teams where there is psychological safety and where they are able to understand how each other feel, make room for that, and have a shared dialogue, shared in the sense that everyone speaks roughly the same amount of time over a set period of time.
Mm,
Those were the teams that had the best performance, irregardless of independent or individual intelligence or expertise, etc. And one thing that some of those studies that have been leading up to that found was that social sensitivity, as measured by
mhm,
a method called reading the mind in the eyes, which is where they see cutouts of eyes only
mhm.
and having to assess how does this person feel right now. The people
Yeah.
who did well in that were the ones who, again, helped promote the most best performing teams. And it must be then that it's just heavily correlated.
Mhm.
So that the people who are able to do that are the same people who have the muscle or the neurological muscle to be able to sense in an audio file or in a voice whether how that person is feeling,
Mm.
right? Don't you think?
I mean, I don't know, right? Like, I don't want to connect the dots automatically because
No, that's
it's
fair.
not something that
Jumping to
I've,
conclusions.
yes, I've not like explored that before or that intersection before. I do know that, probably part of the research coming out of the Aristotle project and specifically this windows of the soul, this like ability of
No, that
understanding
is actually not
emotion
from
through
their
just
study.
eyes.
That is from some of the research that MIT and other big
Yeah.
institutions did around that. Yeah.
I'm sure it relates to the fact that there are universally like understood human expressions, right? Like most people, well, neurotypical people can all identify like one of six emotions from just looking at a person's eyes. And I believe they are like surprise, disgust, anger. Like there's a couple others that I can't recall off the top of my head, but I'm sure that that plays a role there, right? Um, and I'm not here to say like turn all your one-to-ones into audio only calls, but I am here to say there's something you derive from talking to a person outside of written communication that is too beneficial to sleep on and too beneficial to say, I'm not going to do one-to-ones anymore. And that opportunity of like allowing managers to have flexibility in how they conduct one-to-ones, but agreeing on what one of the fundamental purposes of them are is so vital. And like at MUI, we have a leadership framework that we use and we don't try and dictate how people have certain types of conversations at work or to what extent they get into certain things with their direct reports, but we do offer high-level guidance and suggest that you should be building a relationship. You should be expressing care. Like, a person should not be questioning, does my manager or supervisor care about me as a person? Do they know me well? Do they know my personal goals, motivations? Like, these should all be yeses, right? And if they're not, then we should use time differently, maybe. And yeah, like I'm thinking of a practical example for people to take away, because I promised on this call like some actionable tips, right? A very simple way that I structure my one-to-ones with people is to start off with we have an asynchronous page that we share and add to beforehand, and at the very top of it we have a soft well-being indicator, and we just answer, how are we feeling today? Like what's the energy that we're bringing into this space? And we have a red, yellow, or green heart indicator. We put that in and we talk through what it means. So it's like very accessible to give a soft signal to your manager, I'm not doing so hot today. And if you want to say more about that and get into it, we can. And if you don't, it's good that I'm at least aware of that much.
We actually do something very similar, and it's probably
I love
because
that.
some of these things stems from the same thing. So when we have, for example, internal people and culture meetings in our executive team to discuss culture and people practices, etc., our well-being numbers and so forth, we actually start, because that is a sensitive space where we might have to, someone might have to tell me that I'm not being mindful enough about something or intentional about enough something. So we actually start by and in similar conversations where we know this could get a little harsh. We're not here to hurt anyone, but this feedback could be hard to swallow, or at least require the right state of mind.
Yeah.
Even at our board meeting on Friday with our board, I asked them to share how they were feeling prior, so that we knew if anyone we had to be mindful of how to approach them with certain things in that meeting. And every Friday we do a red, yellow, green about how our week has been, and that's just been a really, really great thing to sit down for 15 minutes, state how you feel, and actually be able to sort of close down, say it out loud, gives so much relief, and then closing it down, go on weekend and come back with a fresh mind on Monday. So it's
so small, like so low effort, and yet so highly
yeah,
impactful, right?
yeah.
And especially, I don't do this today. I have when I've led broader teams, but if you start to chart that against a calendar, it can reveal some pretty interesting patterns too, and fluctuations. And, you see where morale and mood are maybe dipping in relation to things happening in the company or things happening in the outside community or in the news or various things like that. And you can be more alert to it, so you can be more proactive about your interventions too. And that's the real value I see in it. It's it's really great.
And to give listeners something actionable as well. Maybe the people who are watching as well can see the small stack of books I have behind me here. We have a leadership playbook that we wrote for managers using SOYAS, and I'll make that available in full digital version on the website as well. So if you want to download that, send me a message or just jump to the website and download that. We'll even remove the email gateway, so you don't have to to give anyone your email to get it. That contains guides, at least good practices and defaults for how to approach one-on-ones for well-being development, salary, and task and performance. So that could be a starting point if you're not doing it today.
I love that you've intentionally separated those conversations too by purpose. Well-being versus development.
I always start when I talk to people about also our one-on-one module is I say I use one-on-one as an umbrella term for not for most people. I think one-on-ones has become synonymous with a check-in, and there's nothing wrong with that. We just use one-on-ones as a category for any conversation that primarily involves two manager or leader and a person, maybe a third person sometimes, but irregardless, we call that one-on-ones, and there are those 5 in our opinion, like tasks for some weekly. If they need help with that, well-being, we recommend monthly, development conversations every 3 to 6 months, something like that. And then salary conversations, performance conversations, also 3 to 6 months, depending on how you set goals, and then salary once a year. But of course, companies have vastly different frequencies for good reasons. But that's something to like at least go from. I think we've discussed to a large degree already how different operating models require different cultures and processes. One thing I did want to ask, because I think it's very interesting, is how much more, if any, structure and sort of how organized are remote companies in your experience compared to centralized on-site companies?
Ooh, interesting. Again, I don't know that I would make the sweeping statement that like remote teams are always more organized. In fact, some are operating with a lot of room for opportunity, if we should put it that way. But I think there are some core differences that look like higher scale organization or more tact, more intentionality. And an example I would give is like documentation, having a culture of documentation. For me, that makes or breaks a remote and hybrid team if they have an established culture of documentation and that people are following that. So I like to say, as a rule, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. Like if it's not documented, it didn't happen as far as I'm concerned here. But an on-site company, I don't see the same emphasis. There's a lot of trust that if you were here and you overheard it or you heard it the first time, like you're on the same page as everyone else. You have the same information as everyone else effectively, and it's just not the case. And I think that's even a major misstep, I would say, going back to thinking about advantages and disadvantages of these different setups. I think hybrid teams very often can fall into a trap of getting a little bit lax about documentation potentially and getting lax about communication. And what happens is people start having different levels of access to information, and therefore there are different degrees of alignment between people. There's different opportunity to contribute between people. You get so much room opened for proximity bias, which, if people aren't familiar, is referring to the tendency of leaders to favor people that they are in physical proximity to and to reward them more with more ownership, more work, more pay, more et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one piece of evidence of greater organization I would cite for remote teams is documentation.
It seems to me when you look at, let's say, operating model guides or cultural guides for how to navigate being a remote company, that you would find, and maybe this is where you can then tell me that you don't think that's the case, but it seems like the level of structure and processes and documentation that one you already gave away, but is just, it's much more in play in remote companies than you would find in the same size or same complexity organization if it wasn't remote.
Mm.
And I'm not necessarily suggesting that it's a bad thing. Quite the opposite. Maybe even that it seems that if you are on site, just because we are in the same room, we can sort of navigate the chaos of not having things documented, thought out, planned, structured. And because we just manage to get by, even though it's chaos, we don't do it because it isn't broken. It might be lacking, but because it isn't broken, we don't fix it necessarily. Whereas it seems like it would be broken in a remote culture, and because of that, it seems to me that the level of structure and organization is just next level in remote companies.
Maybe it's that we have a different idea about when communication is done. So if you're in a meeting and you have a specific purpose for that meeting, you've got a problem to solve, and you come up with all your ideas together, you add context, you add color around what's going on in the organization and people's minds and so on, and then you come up with your agreed solution. It's agreed, done. Maybe in an on-site setting or a hybrid setting, you think, okay, this step is complete. The people who needed to be part of this conversation were present. They all heard the same thing, and now we're done. But for me and at MUI and in a remote org, I think done is now we've written it up and communicated out the pieces of this that are relevant to the different groups that are around in our organization. So like having a clear, almost like a receipt, basically. This meeting took place. Here's who was present. Here's what it means to you. Here's the takeaways for you and how we got there. It's just a little difference in how you think
No, but
about it's
I think that's a good
done.
example of something that, in my experience, doesn't happen much
Mhm.
in an on-site culture.
Yeah, and why would it, right? Like, I mean, to it's
No, but
to
I think I can come up with several reasons why it would.
yeah,
But that the reason hasn't yet seemed obvious enough, in contrast to the remote like workplace, that it's sort of become the norm.
yeah, I should have
And
said
obviously, yeah,
I should have said, "Why should it happen?" And then obviously we have all these reasons why it should happen, and then traditionally it's not happening. Like, why would it? When I ask that question, I'm really kind of poking fun at this like lack of intentionality or what we've talked about prior to starting this live was that I think there's a degree of effort sometimes involved that people shy away from at times. Like, just to be sincere, to be honest, like it takes labor to do this well. And I would never say that like it doesn't take extra labor, extra effort to do remote well. It does. Building these habits, holding people accountable to the norms that you're trying to create, it all requires effort. And some people are really willing to put that in, and some people aren't.
yeah. No, that I've mentioned this before, but like what we see as well is, at least, no, let me state what's the fact, and then I can say what my hypothesis is, and that is, the fact is that we see that companies that are hybrid, where they have a part of the organization that are to some extent fully remote, or at least decentralized from headquarters to a large degree,
Mm.
and then they have a portion of their employees in a central location. Those companies tend to be the ones struggling the most, um, probably because of the lack of intentionality that they they have from sort of having to manage this hybrid organization where, are we one, are we the other? They sort of sit down
Mhm.
between two chairs.
Mhm. It doesn't surprise me that that is the case. I would have the same hypothesis, and like just to underscore, intentionality is everything. I don't care what your work model is. Like without that, you're going to suffer the drawbacks of any of them. Um, and if you choose to be hybrid, I think one of the ways you can best set yourself up for success and your people to thrive in that kind of setting is to make sure that your company's norms and rituals are in closer resemblance to remote ones. So, an example of this, tangible example, if you're conducting meetings and even one person on that team is remote, is dialing in, everybody better have a laptop out. Somebody else should not be at.
But if all they need is audio, why do they need the?
I mean, fine, video free meeting. It's just about the accessibility of the information and like uh, being able to contribute equally to a call as well. If I'm dialing in on a conference call, I've done it before where I've been in a hybrid team where 10 people are sat in a glass room and they have one laptop open for the entire group, and it's really difficult to hear. It's really difficult to contribute and have my voice heard even. I'm relying on somebody also to be holding that laptop in front of them, noticing that I would like to add something, taking me off mute or what have you, right? There's just some different rituals and norms to adopt, I think, if you're hybrid. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. You said ritualize collaboration earlier,
Mm,
and I noted that down as one of the things that you might need to have in your operating model if you are remote.
hmm
Can you say a bit more about what that is for you and how that looks?
Yeah. I mean, to ritualize anything is to make it a repeated practice, first off. Something that is calendarized, even. I might invent that word and use it because I find that if something's in the calendar, it tends to happen. I don't have to trust that it's happening. It is more likely to happen for whatever reason. And in thinking about collaboration, it could be, let's say you have a business problem or you've spotted an opportunity, figuring out a play to invite people into a conversation on it, to invite people to share ideas in a free form yet still structured way so that everyone has the same opportunity to submit. that would be a form of like ritualized collaboration for me. So you might have like nicknames for meeting types, or maybe if you're running an asynchronous workshop to gather ideas, you might have a nickname for that. We're going to have a tag up session. We're going to have a this session. We're going to have a that. I don't know what it's called, but coming up with the terminology and the cadence that it happens at is how you can ritualize collaboration, I think.
And are there some rituals that you've seen have great success at MUI or
Yes.
in other remote cultures that you know of?
Yeah, I would cite a different one to collaboration, and it goes nicely into something else that you and I have been wanting to spend time talking about, which is recognition, gratitude, and how these act as drivers of well-being or social glue for an organization. And something that we launched at MUI very early into my time with them was Thanks and Praise Thursdays. And it's really simple. We have a dedicated Slack channel called Thanks and Praise. And every week, a notification that's automated from a Slack bot pops in there and shares a little poster and encourages people to give a bit of gratitude or recognition to someone on the team that week. So we ask questions like, who has helped you get something done this week? Who's unblocked you? Who has like cared about you? And it's all these behaviors that we would desire to reinforce, right? Some of them even connect back to our core values, of course. It's like documented behavior that we want people repeating them from there. And so everyone can then go in, and it's not restricted to Thursdays either. It's just that Thursday is the day that we have a ritualized reminder, an automated like nudge, if you will. And at first, it was kind of slow to gain traction, of course, because it's new, it's kind of funny, like, I don't know, people were maybe not clear on what they should be using it for. And now I scroll through it and I'm amazed at just how normal it's become to call out one another for great work and to spotlight each other, to celebrate the strengths and unique greatness that everyone's bringing into our team. Like, it's my favorite day of the week, of course, now.
I have so many thoughts about, because I mean, just first off, we also have, we call it hot shower. A couple of times on our vacations, we have a vacation every 6 months where we go abroad for a week together. Even though we are together all the time at the office as well. But we typically have a different schedule there than we do day to day. We've done this, some people call the compliment circle, where everyone has prepared a few minutes, has had a few minutes to prepare what they want to compliment the person who's going in the hot chair for. And we sort of wanted to take that and make it more day-to-day accessible, that praise and thanks is giving more commonly. But it still seems like the depth of feedback and appraisal or thanks you would get, the way you would get it, is so individual that once we ritualize it, and I'm also speaking about our setup here, and just with curiosity, honestly, whether you have some insight into, like, it feels like once you establish a ritual about it, the ritual becomes the norm, and it sort of potentially standardizes something for everyone to some degree that isn't necessarily, at least ideal, might be the best we can do, because we don't have a more clever or creative solution or a better way of getting people to do it. But do you see the challenges I'm getting at?
I think so. It's like you want to offer structure and you want to offer dedicated space so that it's easy for people to participate. But you don't want to constrain people in being able to offer this outside of the ritual. Like, you don't want people to think that this is the space where recognition happens now. And you also don't want people to think that, well, I can only recognize my peer for having done one of these 10 behaviors that these questions like aim at, right?
Well, I was actually more thinking, like, if you have a channel for it and you make that a ritual, I would assume it lowers the odds, all else being equal. And this might not be true. This is taking a leap, but I would assume that it lowers the odds that I would write you individually and maybe have room to include some stuff that made it more personal. Or it would decrease the odds that I would say it on a weekly meeting because I already put it in the channel. So now I'm repeating myself in front of everyone. Or I won't go and give you this appraisal in person because we have a channel for that. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily true in all cases, but it does seem like an obvious risk of structurally building a ritual for thanks and appraisals.
That's interesting. And I think like one flexible aspect of our thanks and praise is that it's connected to our HRS, which is Hi Bob. It's not a secret or anything. And you have the ability to choose like who your message is going to be visible to. If you want it to be visible to the whole company, then you indicate that and it will feed into the channel. But if you only want it to be sent to the person who you are trying to express recognition or gratitude to, you have that capability. And I think this goes back to talking about good management and like the effort required and the intentionality required. I keep saying that word. It's going to be everyone's word for the next week, but
intentional leadership, that's good.
Intentional leadership. I might send a public piece of recognition or gratitude for one of my team members, and I might send them a private one highlighting different things, right?
Yeah.
Like we just concluded a fun little async initiative at MUI. We did a mystery game, kind of a whodunit style thing where people were investigating characters who might have stolen a diamond from a museum. We like came up with a storyline and characters and all kinds of stuff. And there were different challenges behind the scenes to building this, to facilitating it right. And then there are different things that I might want to celebrate and highlight publicly to the whole team to make them aware of it. So I sent a thanks and praise out about my direct report, being like, yep, big shout out here. Here's what was done, just to let you all know of the effort that went into it. And then maybe behind the scenes, I have something private to share with her that's more specific to our actual build experience or facilitation experience. Yeah.
No, and I think it makes sense. I'm probably just mentioning it is because it's something we've had in our mind of we don't want to standardize it too much. So we just, as long as you say it out loud, you probably even manage most of the risk anyway. That people shouldn't strive away from these things just because we've built a structural approach to it here that makes sure that we get to a certain degree by default almost. But so moving on from that, like we have this how to succeed with recognition and collaboration, especially in a remote setting. Do you feel there's something important that we need to dive into there, apart from what we've already discussed?
Let's see. I'm taking a look at some of my notes that I was writing this morning in the garden while prepping for this call. I mean, I think going back to it might be useful actually to just share some of the research and statistics behind the power of recognition, because I will wager that some people listening into this call are potentially still not convinced of it. Because that's a common thing I've run into before in the past, is like people questioning the real impact that something like a thanks and praise message can have on somebody's work experience and therefore their engagement and performance.
Yeah, I'm not trying to call anyone on our team out, but we were on a vacation in Spain in November last year. One of the topics of one of our workshops was recognition. Several, maybe even half, said, I don't really have a big need for that.
This I want to dive into.
I knew I would get you kickstarted with that.
You've got me now, yes. Because this is a really, really common response, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with it either, by the way. Like, there's so much to potentially unpack in that type of reaction to somebody saying, hey, there's power in recognition. We should give this generously, and we should, give it in a way that is most meaningful to people. To someone who says, I don't need recognition personally, I would tend to ask them the question, what type of recognition is meaningful to you? Because I know from organizational and human psychology that everyone shares in this fundamental need to be recognized. Now, recognition is not reducible to praise, which is a mistake I think people make. It can be gratitude. It can be seeing the person and meeting them where they are. It's not just about doing a job well done, right? There are other desirable behaviors and mindsets and attitudes you would want to reinforce by recognizing someone. Recognition can also be like giving someone more ownership and autonomy over their work, giving them more influence, like paying them more. Like it's so massive.
That's actually a thing I've seen repeatedly over the past few months with close relationships of mine, is that increases, or let's say not even necessarily increases, changes in their work, like the autonomy they get, the responsibility they get, unless it's explicitly stated as recognition, it's not seen as that.
Yes, because there is the paradox of I work so well that I'm getting rewarded with more work, right?
Yeah, or even like we're no longer doing as many check-ins, for example, which might be the leader just feeling comfortable that you'll manage or that you will do the proact. Like they don't have to be proactive; they can be reactive because they trust you to run with it, and that can feel like being let go. Funny thing, actually, we helped a fully remote American organization, 100 people, fully remote. They used a framework called CAMPS, where one of the things they measured was autonomy. And what was so interesting about it is we ran a test where we took our framework of measuring well-being, ENPS, and job satisfaction and mental health, 11 questions versus their 5. And we found that when I did the sort of the regression analysis afterwards to see how their models stacked up, actually it had zero like connection to job satisfaction. And actually autonomy, the higher they scored on autonomy, the lower the chance that they would promote the workplace.
That is fascinating.
Probably because autonomy is not the more the better. It's a perfect balanced amount where I still feel like I'm being seen, recognized, met, we are interacting. Really interesting.
It's also the balance of having the right degree of influence over your outcomes, right? Influence over your work, and like the conditions that you're under versus the right support to make it all happen, to bring your goals to life or to fruition, right? And yeah, that's super interesting.
It's just funny that something that the question that they used in their let's call it well-being survey, then that it made sense. It was logical until you ask, what are we optimizing for? What do we want? What are we trying to understand here? And there is an underlying assumption, of course, that the more autonomy, the better, which turned out to be not true, at least if you're looking for overall job satisfaction or the chance that people are so happy they would promote the workplace.
Yeah.
And that was super interesting.
I've got like another just takeaway now. If we think that intentionality is everything in like a remote setting, well, an individualized approach is everything when it comes to good management, I would say. So your findings from this survey and from this comparison with your different ways of measuring this makes me think about how, again, if somebody is denying that there's a need for recognition, or maybe isn't understanding how to give it, or maybe they feel like they're giving it a lot, but for some reason their direct reports don't feel like they're receiving it. There's a disconnect there. That suggests to me that there's something wrong in the individualization of the approach, right? Like, this is why it is so critical for managers to know their team members so deeply well that they know what type of recognition matters to you, right? Like me, I love a private message. A quick little 3 bullets of you did these things so well, please keep doing that, means everything to me.
We did a fun little exercise where in the team where one of our consultants was facilitating. We're talking about recognition as one of several questions. We're standing on a field at one of these offsites, and we're standing on a line. Now go to the right, and the further to the right you go, the more it's because the recognition that works for you is like almost constructive. It's very feedback driven, and
Mhm.
it's deep. It's not shallow in the sense that it's a pat on the shoulder. And then go to the left, the more you actually feel recognized, even by the small, let's call them insignificant gestures, because they're not insignificant, but I'm missing words to explain what I mean, but I think it comes across.
Mhm.
And it was funny to see how people would just spread out, and for some, a clap on the shoulder almost is, it does nothing for them,
Mhm.
and for others that's all they need, and that really, it's, and I think it's hard as a manager to necessarily meet. I mean, first step is to understand what people want, prefer, need, and the second step is to execute on that. And I think the first one is the easier one of those, but it still comes first.
Mhm. Mhm. It's so interesting, and it doesn't, again, it's not surprising, right? People are different, and we might share in some fundamental needs, and there might be different ways of satisfying those needs for each of us. And
But I think it's hard to fathom on that before you dive into it. Because I
absolutely.
think we all have a default to think like that is a strong human default to think that others think like we do, and to think that others like. Nils did a video where he starts off by saying, "Treat others the way you like to be treated." How shitty leadership advice is that?
Yeah.
That is not the way. That is not the way to lead a team or lead individuals.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I agree that we have a default and a bias to kind of just projecting our preferences onto other people, and that this is a habit that I really, really want to get away from when it comes to being a leader or a manager myself, or trying to help enable and empower other leaders to be better at what we do. 100%, like not projecting personal preferences is a piece of that. And how great that you could be together physically to illustrate the scale of this and the difference, and to suddenly have this light bulb moment as a group that, oh, we all need this, but look at the range of ways and extents that we need it to, and how that differs. And I think it's important, just as a closing point to that, to suspend and withhold judgment about any of these being the right or wrong thing, or what else it might say about an individual. Because this has been a curiosity of mine too, of when people say that they don't need recognition, as an individual who does need it, and says that explicitly, sometimes I wonder if there is maybe some assimilation, or like surrendering to stigma about wanting to be recognized, like maybe that it's a bad thing. It's like dirty and bad to want credit and to want praise for doing what you should do, your job well. Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I think we try to at least breach that, because I do think I have no doubt in my mind that is, there is a stigma around wanting appraisal.
Mhm.
Um, that is sort of to some degree contextualized in like an attention-seeking kind of way that wouldn't bring positive connotations along the ride. Um, but like for example, I also think it's hard to figure out what type of recognition you actually need. So
Mhm.
probably finding a good way, and I don't have the answer for that, but figuring out how people, helping people actually figure out how they need it, because I've found with myself, and this is a little bit vulnerable for me, but that when when I bring new ideas or something I am proud of and presenting that, that is the moment where you can make or break my feeling of recognition.
Mhm.
Because if I'm shut down by criticism in a moment where I it might have seemed like I wanted feedback,
Mhm.
because I came and showed you something, but I just did it because that is the moment where my recognition comes through the most, is where uh, I just need to, I need a little bit of hype back, some enthusiasm,
Mhm.
and then we can change it later. But it's funny that I found that it's not so much day to day, it's in those moments where I'm proud to present something that I need it back.
Mhm.
Um, and then we have others like Nils, our head of consulting, who is very vivid and open about it. I love recognition, written, oral, public, private. Give it as much as you feel like.
Mhm.
I'll swallow all of it.
Well, thinking about, first off, I deeply relate to you in wanting to be met with an initial enthusiasm and like just engagement. positive engagement of some kind when I've presented something I've been working on or that I feel really passionately about. And if I don't get that, it's very harmful to my morale. Like I definitely feel the energy just like weeping out of me. And so I can understand where you're coming from with that. Now I'm thinking about frequency because you're describing this person you work with or in the consultancy and his appetite just being very, very large, right?
Yeah.
What do you think about the fact that Gallup discovered through their research that the most impactful frequency of recognition on engagement, so the cadence it needs to happen at in order to improve people's engagement tangibly, is once every 7 days? What's your initial reaction to that frequency?
I think it's hard to take out of context. I'm not really sure of the parameters of that particular research from Gallup, but I would say if you don't feel on a weekly basis, which is sort of the memory that most of us operate on, it's like that's life currently. That's the past week, maybe two, and then it makes sense that if you haven't felt recognized or gotten praise in a week, that would impact morale.
Yeah. It's interesting because some people have like really, yes, of course, I would obviously prefer to hear something once a week or to have some sort of mechanism once a week activated. And then others are like, that's way too frequent. They have a almost like a
Depends on what that's why I mean it depends so much on what you put into it, right?
yeah.
But that's really cool.
It is a very interesting piece of data though. And one that is like, very robustly demonstrated. This is like thousands of data points across, years long studies.
They have some good big data sets to run with
Indeed.
over at Gallup.
Mm-hmm.
From a collaboration standpoint, if we move on from recognition a little bit, what do you experience remote companies doing in terms of collaboration? And if I'm just digging for the final stuff here, because I think we have gone over this to some degree, but is there anything that you see or someone joining MUI from an on-site company that they would see you doing differently to succeed with your operating model in terms of collaboration?
I mean, absolutely, right? It's in how we take ideas from inception to reality. I mean, that's what looks really different. And for us, an idea starts with a written document, right? We utilize something called shaping pages, and they are completely visible across the whole company, all departments. We have one centralized repo for them, one database basically. And there's not a heavy structure around how a shaping page needs to be filled out either. So it's quite flexible, but we pretty much ask for three things like context on what is the problem that you see this idea solving, or like why this idea, what's inspired it, why are we paying attention to it, and why now? And then a space to explore options. So an area where you demonstrate different approaches that you've maybe considered and a justification for why you want to pursue a particular one.
So it could be any idea from, I think we should move from Slack to Microsoft Teams to, I think we should add this module in HiBob.
Yes, nothing's off limits. It could be,
Cool. Okay.
I want to hire this person. I think we should change our
Let's
tooling.
use that as example then, because it's just to have something practical to tie it up on. So then,
or even, we have ones around how we should change certain internal processes, right?
yeah.
How do we scale employee rewards and recognition? How do we do this? How do we do that?
So the page is created. The author, the person who at least chose to run with for this problem or at this problem, they fill out, what was the first thing was context, problem, ideation, whatever.
Yeah, like context of what's the problem or opportunity that you see. What are some options or approaches that you have explored? And what's the option you want to pursue and why? So it's kind of those three things loosely construed. And at that point, the person can either let it sit, like maybe it's not time sensitive, maybe it's just an idea they didn't want to forget. and that we intend to come back to at a later point in time. Or maybe it is time sensitive, and at that point, the person would choose to share it. Share it in our Slack, call attention to it, invite contribution from across the org. And some people are really great about this, and the way that they do it is they say, I'd like your feedback on this space to start, right? They almost like go through an iterative process of like unfurling each section. It's like, let me get people's initial reactions to just this idea that I had, or like check if others feel the same problem that I think I see. Next, let me invite people to add options that I haven't considered, or, stress test the logic and the practicality and the feasibility of the things that I have written down as potential approaches. And then let's come to a final conclusion. Let's not get necessarily consensus depending on the type of change and size of it and who is the ultimate decision maker there, but let's get like consent. Nobody should be holding their hands up, flagging down, saying, absolutely not. I'm resigning if we go forward with this, that type of thing.
If you are implementing one-on-one conversations, I am out of here.
Yeah,
No.
can you imagine? Mm.
Okay, so maybe to summarize, it's just that so much of your decision making, your collaboration is async, and written. So it's not oral, it's not in meetings
Mhm.
to the same degree
Yeah,
at all.
definitely. I mean, it primarily happens asynchronously, and there are some things that obviously we will escalate to a call where it's
Yeah.
clear that it's going to be a more productive, more effective discussion, or maybe we need a decision today, and therefore we don't have the time to engage in long form back and forth discussion, and it's better to be on a call with one another. That's fine. I would say the other difference is, at least today at MUI, given the size of the team, and this has been true about us since inception, it's like nothing is off limits for anyone to contribute to. So I'm not over here in the people camp saying, you can't talk to me or offer ideas or feedback about how we do performance cycles or how we do comp reviews or how we do this. Anyone is allowed and invited, encouraged to bring their perspective forward, because that's how we're going to build something better.
My only experience in relation to that is negative, because we strive for the same level of collaboration at Sawyers, but sometimes, and I even feel this in myself, I also experience it in others, is it puts a big demand on the people receiving the feedback to sort of navigate in it
Mm-hmm.
and to some degree communicate back. So even though it would be a decent setup if we said, no, you can't expect an answer. You can give your input, and the person is obligated to read your input.
Mm-hmm.
But from there, they navigate
Yes.
their responsibilities still to the best of their abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And you might never hear what happened to your idea.
Mm.
But that seems logical. But then from an emotional point of view, it seems like that seems dissatisfying. If you felt you came up with a good idea, not really knowing, is it ever going to be prioritized? I know it was read, but is it ever going to be prioritized? If yes, when, how, how will it come to life?
Yeah.
That is one thing that I think also we internally are trying to figure out how to navigate those two things, because clearly overemphasizing that could become a big bureaucracy.
Yes.
But not doing it at all seems to demotivate people from even being responsible for the organization as a whole, instead of just their little bit of key core responsibilities.
I would share that we experience the same thing. We are also in this process of kind of calibrating and figuring out what the right degree of input is, or at least how to properly communicate who the decision maker is, and to make sure that people know that hearing an idea doesn't mean integrating it, and not integrating the idea doesn't mean it wasn't considered with fairness and like with care, right? There's a reason that you hire certain people with different types of expertise, right? And so great ideas come from everywhere, and they also come from more and less informed positions, right? Like you might have some brilliant ideas about women's health, right? I might have some more informed ideas about women's health just having lived with women's health. Like,
Yeah.
and I think it's useful to try and find a healthy and, like, I don't know, just find the right way of conveying that to each other, and yeah, just developing a high degree of trust in each other's capabilities to know, like, Mikaila's going to hear my idea and she's going to make the best decision available given this context. Like, yeah, that is a hard thing to strike, though, and I've felt it as well personally. Yeah.
We'll get back to everyone when we figure out the silver bullet for that. Before, I mean, we still have some people live, so I'll just, if anyone has a question that they're dying to ask, now is the time, because we will be wrapping up soon. Also being aware of time, we have been going for an hour and a half. So if anyone has a question or something they would like our take on, please add a comment now. We had a comment a while back from Victoria Myerscore. I hope I said that right. That one-to-ones in a remote team are extremely valuable. So, the last point, something we've also like sort of done gradually as we've spoken, because I think that made more sense, is what can centralized organizations learn from decentralized organizations?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that some of the practices of remote work, particularly that we're discussing right now, also with more async contributions to documents, to ideas, to formulating these things, have grown in organizations like ours, where we are centralized, but where we do see get an influence from the remote culture in terms of adding some of these things, because they might actually be better practices.
Mm.
Are there some
Yeah.
things that you have thought about that you think that at least on-site centralized organizations should consider adopting from
Mm.
what is more commonly thought of as being something that's part of a remote culture?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to go sort of left field with this. Like, rather than talk about protocols or processes, I want to talk about a mindset, and specifically the one around social connection and loneliness. I think centralized organizations would really benefit from rethinking these things, not thinking about them as events, not thinking about them as spaces, because at the end of the day, like, inclusion is not a place, it's a feeling. And it's not about being seen or being present in the same spot as somebody else. It is literally about feeling accepted for who you are. And I think, we hear so much this argument of come back to the office because it's where we can have culture. And then there's discussion of after work beers and this and that. And it's all very shallow as engagements, and it's not making use of the psychological levers that you start to become and have to make use of in a remote setting in order to drive connection between people. An example of what I'm talking about. One of the best ways that you can build connection with somebody else is literally to just figure out what you have in common with them. Finding out what we share in terms of values, life experiences, goals, aspirations, what's important to us. That is a very powerful form of connecting individuals, and it doesn't happen on its own, even if you're hanging out by a water cooler or in a pub. It doesn't. If you do this with more intentionality, though, you can construct these really meaningful engagements, and they could be like 10 times more impactful if you have on-site, physical presence at your disposal alongside these things. Yeah, so that's one. Going back to the short form, rethink your ideas on social connection and loneliness. Okay, you're not going to solve it by just
Yep.
bringing everyone back to the office.
No, so it's not physical proximity, it's managing sort of at least or facilitating a room for some different
Yeah,
conversations,
from
whatever that might be in your culture, your context,
more
etc.
meaningful conversations. This is
Meaningful
another
conversations.
issue that I saw happening with companies during the pandemic, for instance, trying to come up with social initiatives and leaning on coffee chats, right? There's no structure, there's no intentionality, and if you want people to bond meaningfully, they need something more meaningful to talk about than coffee. They need to do something more meaningful together than share coffee. There is a way to drive deeper connection between people by having shared experiences, shared challenges, and so much more. So finding ways to create those opportunities, regardless of where you are working from, is, I think, just a very powerful thing to do. Yeah.
I just thought of a thing that I should have brought up earlier now it really benefits us that we don't have a time limit. So I'll try to cap it to 5 minutes, but it's something that I don't know why I haven't thought of. I have a belief that managing development for younger people, not necessarily younger people, but just people with less expertise in a certain domain, is harder when you are not around to hear how they see, hear, and experience how they manage work or manage their craft. How do you feel about that?
I think I agree. And again, I hesitate to sit myself firmly in any one camp on this because I reflect on my own experiences starting out in my career and also being remote a lot of the time then. I went through lots of different industries and lots of different role types, and I had to learn and pick up and navigate on my own. And I went outside of the office to do that. I went and sought, because I was often a very small department. I might have even been a standalone, in a lot of these cases.
Yeah.
Whether that was in like a marketing capacity or publishing or membership management, like lots of stuff. And I went and sought out my own mentors. I went and sought my own education outside of that space. That's a very specific type of individual or like a specific mindset that a person would have who would do that. And I'm not making any sort of like virtue claims around that. But I am saying that it's possible to do. It is possible to do outside of the workplace. And at the same time, I see the ease at which young people coming into an office just seem to have more opportunity around them to, as you said, overhear, access people more readily, like build relationships, I guess. I don't know. There just seems to be more easy access there.
Yeah, and for the same reasons, might be the same reasons that an on-site office is on average a little less, has a little lower productivity than if at least per hour or something along those lines. If we assume that, then that might be part of the trade-off, right? That you are interrupted more if you're sitting with your colleagues all around you, for better or worse. And I think one of the things that, at least stereotyping, but development is one of the things that then gains from that, and productivity and contribution sometimes lacks or takes a hit for the same reasons.
And I think also like this is one of the influences on why hybrid is turning out to be a more sought model recently, right? I think there's evidence and statistics about how hybrid is now the more sought or more popular setup than fully remote or fully on-site. And part of this is this big Gen Z influence that's about to make up like 30% of the workforce, right? They want to be in office. A lot of them want to be in office for the exact reasons you described. And sometimes I wonder how much of that is a self-efficacy thing. Like, I don't believe in my ability to learn or get further faster without participating in this type of work or this setting. And how much of that is also being influenced by headlines like "Get back into the office or you're not promotable," signed Dell.
Or self-reflections that they might not be ready to manage work
Independently.
on their own independently as it would require for them to be in a fully remote like for some it might be very natural, but I think for many the first few years after graduating is a process of learning how to navigate and manage work in a professional context, and that's quite different from school or academia or other types of training or development you've gone through, right?
Absolutely.
So Yeah, that makes a lot of
And that
sense.
makes me think about a question we raised earlier that now I would add to, which was, what do you think are the most critical or vital traits for somebody to have that's operating in a remote context versus on site? And you just said two of them, self-awareness and discipline. Like self-awareness and really openness to know yourself honestly and to know what are going to be my challenges in operating remotely and in working at home. And then having discipline to overcome them.
Do you think it would be fair to just translate discipline to motivation?
Yeah, maybe, because
Because at least the talents and the way we talk about it, like someone could be extremely driven, but be lacking discipline.
I think I'm tempted
Because
to
it could be different.
I'm tempted to keep discipline because of exactly
Fair.
what you just described. Like your motivation is kind of meaningless unless you can act on it consistently, right? So I think discipline is quite necessary, and maybe there's just some negative connotations that we're trying to get around with that term.
No, I think discipline is a great talent. It's just I think I would find many people who perform extremely well and thrive in remote contexts with discipline as something I would not describe as one of their
I wonder
talents.
if like
But I do think it's a terminology thing, though.
I
Uh,
wonder if a
yeah,
term where these two kind of meet or converge might be a different thing that's come to mind, resourcefulness. Because resourcefulness umbrellas motivation. Like you have motivation to find solutions to whatever the challenges you are aware of are. And definitely resourcefulness, I would say, has been incredibly important for my way of working. Yeah.
awesome way to cap it off. Mikaila, I think this has been a great start to the show. I think we should round up, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to both prep but also do the live episode here.
No, I really enjoyed it. I appreciate the thoughtful discourse, the invitation, and I hope people listening took some valuable insights away from us. I certainly have taken away a lot that's kind of changing my perspective on some things and making me want to research in other places. So, yeah, just thank you. I really, really enjoyed chatting with you.
Likewise. Is there any place you'd like to direct people? Or where can they find where should they go to find you or
Oh,
follow you?
well, if you're tuned into the LinkedIn Live, then you already know where to find me. Click my profile picture, click my name, and go ahead and give me a follow. And if you're listening in, then you can find me at linkedin.com/in/my name, which is spelled Mikaila and then READ, like read a book. I would also give a quick gesture to the MUI.com/careers page. We have a ton of always remote opportunities, a really, I would say, enviable work environment. And we are always looking for brilliant engineers to join our team. And we have some other open roles too. So don't stay away if you're not an engineer. Come check us out anyway.
That's awesome. Great opportunity for the people listening. Let's round off. Thank you so much. And to all the listeners, have a great day.
Bye.